Okay, so the topic today is actually twofold. The first is the Ten Commandments. In a sense, this is a new series. In a sense, it's really a continuation of those of you who were with us before of the same thing. We're learning the Sefer Chinuch. We're trying to go through all 613 commandments. We've done, believe it or not, the first 24 according to the Sefer Chinuch. Some of them were mixed together, so we were able to sort of cover a little ground. We didn't have 24 Shirim, I think we had maybe 15, but we were able to cover the first 24. And now we're at the 25th commandment, which happens to be the commandment to believe in God, and therefore it's also the beginning of the next 10, which will be the 10 Commandments. But of course, the Sefer Chinuch reminds us right away that the 10 Commandments are not really 10 Commandments. In fact, what do we call them? We don't call them commandments at all. We call them the Aseret Dibrot, the 10 utterances. And that's going to be the first question, sort of by way of introduction, before we get to the actual command of belief in God. I want to just look sort of more globally at the 10 Commandments. So if you see in the source sheet, the first question that I put up there, are there 10 commandments or are there 10 utterances? The Sefer Chinuch, according to his counting, there's actually 14 separate mitzvot within the 10 utterances. And there's some people, therefore, who say the 10 utterances aren't even relating to these commandments. The reason why we have to say the 10 utterances, the Aseret Dibrot, is because the Torah says there are Aseret Dibrot. But some people, for example, I think his name is Rav Rak in Gush Etzion, he argues that the 10 utterances are not these commandments, but rather there's 10 statements that God makes in this entire scene of Moshe ascending and receiving these commandments, as well as then he receives the mitzvot of making the Mishkan, which are not included in the 10 commandments, but he says these are part of the 10 utterances. So one of the first questions we'll look at is the distinction between the commandments and the utterances. What might there be? So if you look at the first source, you see the Sefer Chinuch, he lists 14 different commandments. They're all the ones we're familiar with, right? Belief in God, which is what we're going to do today. And then he says there's not just one, but there's a few mitzvot that are connected to the second commandment, how we usually understand it, the second commandment of not to believe in any other God. And then we have, of course, not to swear in vain. All these we will go through. Shabbat, you notice, there are actually two separate mitzvot, he understands. The precept of hallowing the Shabbat in words, that's saying Kiddush, as well as not to do any work on Shabbat. So those are two distinct mitzvot, but they're both included within the psukim, the verses that are in the Torah itself. So if there are more than 10 commandments, why is it that we're always so focused on the number 10? I mentioned one answer. The Torah suggests that there's a Aseret Dibrot. So what else might be there? So one thing you can do is that there's a whole series of commentaries who want to teach us something about the structure of the tablets, because we're told that the Torah is given in these tablets, and we're told that the tablets are parallel, but they're clearly not, right? The first half, the first 5, which we usually assume are connected to mitzvot ben adam lemakom, have many, many psukim, have about 5 times more the amount of psukim than the psukim on the second half. So it was obviously weighted, but nevertheless, it was important for the rabbis to push them so that they're somehow parallel. And the question is why. So you'll look at the Mechilta, for example, which is the second source. By the way, just as an aside, something that I just learned recently, someone told me he was the president of a university in Oklahoma. And he told me that when he grew up, he was an older individual, in Oklahoma, there was a big court case, as there's been in Alabama and many other states, about putting the 10 Commandments on the front of the courts, because the courts, many of these more conservative places, want to say that we draw our inspiration and our authority from the 10 Commandments. And of course, there are a lot of big legal cases about whether or not that's an infringement of religion and state, putting them on a public courthouse. So anyway, he told me, what's the genesis? Where did this all come about in the first place, that people started putting these 10 Commandments there? So he says it goes back to the movie, right? You remember the Cecil movie, The 10 Commandments? As a marketing tool, they made a ton of these 10 commandments, these very large things that they wanted to put all over the country as a way of marketing the movie that was coming. And then they had this surplus of 10 commandments. And so they started figuring out, where can we give them? They started giving them out to whoever asked them, and a lot of courts started asking for them. So the real impetus is not the conservative values of middle America, but rather the liberal values of Hollywood. It's just an interesting dynamic of what took place there. If you look at the Mechilta, so the Mechilta gives us one explanation of what these 2 rows of tablets are supposed to teach us. In what form were the 10 commandments given? With 5 on the first tablet and 5 on the second. There's 10 because we needed the 5 and the 5. It is written on the first tablet, I am the Lord your God. That's supposed to be parallel to, you'll write across, right? What's right across in the 5 and 5? So to the do not murder. What's the connection of belief in God and do not murder? Well, every human being is created in the image of God. When you murder, you not only destroy that person, you desecrate the Tselem Elohim, you desecrate God's image. So there's a relationship between the two. The second, right? Do not have any other gods. That corresponds to not commit adultery, right? Very often throughout Tanakh, adultery is compared to idolatry, right? Cheating on one's spouse is as cheating on belief in one God. You see the parallel there. It goes on and gives other examples. Some are, I think, a little bit more difficult to fully justify than the others. For example, what's the connection of theft and not taking God's name in vain? Well, if you steal, you will come to court and you will have to say that I didn't steal, and therefore you'll have to take an oath and violate God. It's a little bit trickier, but there are Shabbat, right, and false testimony. On Shabbat, we stand, right? Why do we stand to recite Kiddush? It's because we are giving testimony, right, that God created the world. So that's parallel. Do not give false testimony, right, because they're obviously related. And honoring one's parents and do not covet. So in the do not covet, included is do not covet your neighbor's spouse, right? That will lead to, sexual immorality. It will lead to having a child that will then not honor one's parents. As I say, some of them are a little bit more stretched than the others, but that's at least the Mechilta, and others have additional understandings of trying to make that connection. There's another way of trying to sort of create a connection between the 5 and the 5, and that's if you look at the source sheet number 3. The Ibn Ezra writes that this is actually, I think it's called a chiastic, right? Which is the first is connected to the last, right? The second is connected to the second to last, and then it's like this, right? Yeah, it's a ABBA in poetry. It comes from the Greek, right? Which is the CHI, which is usually X, right? The reason, we're familiar with a holiday that takes place at the end of December, right? That's not really a cross, right? It's an X in Greek as the basis of that, and it actually emanates from this. So what the Ibn Ezra doesn't actually tell us what the relationship of, let's say, the first, which is belief in God, and the last, right, because they're connected, of do not covet, although we could come up with some of our own, what they might be. You could suggest, for example, that once you have belief in God and that all is from God, you don't have no need to covet, right? Because whatever you're receiving is a gift from God anyway. But he doesn't necessarily offer it to us, but Nechama Leibovich does offer a suggestion. She says that some of the mitzvot have to do with thought, some of the mitzvot have to do with speech, and some of the mitzvot have to do with action. And by the way, I should point out that this type of poetic structure exists not just here in the Ten Commandments, but exists in many other places. Just to give you an idea on why it might be significant, if you look at right below there, it's very clear in the story of Noah, right? If you look at some of the examples of Noah, someone went to the time, I didn't do this, of telling us, I'm at the first column of the first page, at the very bottom. It says Noah and his sons. Yeah, that's A. Now, it goes to the next page, the next column, and you'll see at the very end, it's Noah and his sons also. This is basically a breakdown of the whole story. And you see, Noah and his sons, then it talks about all the life on earth, and then the curse on the earth, and then the flood is announced, and then the ark, on and on and on. It hits a center point where it says God remembers Noah, and then it sort of springs back, all the way back, and it gets all the way back to Noah and his sons. So it's A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then, I can't do it so fast, right? G, D, C, B, A. Now, why in the world would we have such a structure? Like, why do we need this type of structure at all? By the way, it's interesting that this poetic structure did come up in the debate of biblical criticism, because before people recognized that the story of Noah was actually in this structure, biblical critics said, this is a perfect case to prove that the Bible was not written by God, not written by one source, but written by many different editors, because they keep repeating themselves. They tell the story about Noah and his sons, and then at the end they tell the story of Noah's. So it must have been two different stories that they just plopped together. But once you notice that it actually is of this structure, what are we supposed to learn from this structure? So the first thing that people will always argue when it's in this structure is that it's much easier to remember the story, because you basically remember a few points, and then you spring back with the exact same points. There's another, I think, very important thing that you learn from this structure, which is it highlights the central theme and focus of the story, right? If you just tell it one way, you have to sort of pick out what is the highlight. Here it does it for you, right in the middle. You can look at it. God remembers Noah. That's the theme of the story of the flood, that there's a relationship with God and humanity, which we spoke about once before, is the exact antithesis of all the other flood stories that exist. Right? All the other flood stories that exist is that there is no relationship between the gods, and the humans. Gods get upset. The reason why they decide to have the flood is because the humans wake them up, and the gods have no patience for them. They don't care. There's no hope. Here, it's the exact opposite. God cares for Noah and his family. Just out of interest, I put down below as well, the same type of structure exists with numbers, right? There's the story of 7 days of waiting in the ark, and it's parallel at the very end, 7 days of waiting for the dove at the end, just so you can sort of see that in a physical manifestation. I'd like to suggest there's another reason why you have this structure, but we're going to come back to it. But just remember that there's another value in having the structure as it is, but we'll come back to it in just a moment by first looking back at the Ten Commandments. So Nechama Leibovich had an understanding how she thought the Ibn Ezra was trying to tell us in this regard. So she says thought leads to speech, which leads to action. What's the first commandment? Belief in God. And she would include the second commandment of not to have any other gods before God. That's thought. Then we get to action. Don't take God's name in vain. Shabbat. Honoring one's parents. Do not murder. Right? Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. These are all action-oriented. Now we spring back. Right? What are we springing back to? We spring back to speech. Don't give false testimony. And then all the way we end at thought again. Do not covet. That's the actual structure, and what the structure does for us in this instance, we'll see in a little bit. The Sefer Chinuch, he's going to talk about what's the essence of this mitzvah of belief in God, and the Sefer Chinuch is going to talk about, and he's spoken about this before, if you remember, about what is the relationship between thought and action. Right? Usually we say thought, you have to believe something. And then the action follows, precedes it. But what did the Sefer Chinuch say, if you remember, in the Mitzvah of Pesach? He says, no. Action often precedes thought, right? If you act a certain way, eventually it will influence how you're feeling. We gave the example of Edgar Allan Poe, who lived a somewhat depressed life, that he would put a pencil in his mouth sometimes, would force and bite on it, forcing himself to smile, which actually released chemicals that told him because he's smiling, he must be happy. And the action tricked him to think that he was potentially happy. So that's part of the Sefer Chinuch's general vision throughout all of his mitzvot. And what's important about this structure is if it's A, B, be A, it teaches us that A always precedes B, but also B has to precede A. And so what you kind of get is a snowball effect. The Torah is telling us you first have to have a proper thought, belief in God. You have to start with that. Now, once you have that belief in God, so that will hopefully influence how you talk. And once you talk and you say things, right? If a person talks about God, so then they're going to be embarrassed to be a hypocrite, to do terrible things. So hopefully that then influences them in their actions. But that's not where it ends. The actions then that you do of not murdering, of not stealing, of honoring your parents, of Shabbat, right? Those actions then influence how you speak, right? As the Sefer Chinuch would say. And how you speak then influence how you think. But look what's really happened. In the beginning, you start with a very general belief in God. But if you go through this process correctly, how do you end up? You're now thinking about something much, much more refined and focused, about your relationships with your neighbor. You're thinking the proper way of thinking about your neighbor and your neighbor's ox and your neighbor's spouse and your neighbor's house. In other words, your thinking has actually become much more refined as well. And this just goes on and on. It's a vicious or a positive cycle. Your thinking leads to your speech, to your action, back to your thinking, to your speech, on and on and on, around and around. So that's another reason perhaps for the structure as it is. Okay. If you turn the page, as I mentioned, I'm going to give you a third reason for this structure, which we've already alluded to, but we're going to see it more in depth now as we turn to the actual mitzvah. Before I get to the mitzvah of belief in God, just one more word of introduction about the Ten Commandments themselves. If you look on the second page at the top, the one Hebrew text that I brought, this is from Rav Sadia Gaon. Rav Sadia Gaon tells us the Ten Commandments. Let me back up before I say that. When you were in shul for Parshat Yitro, how many of you stood for the Ten Commandments? Okay. Let's turn to the second page. The second page is at the very top, number 4. 10 Commandments versus 613 Commandments. That's Rav Sadia Gaon. Right. So why does the Rambam say you should sit? They're all equal. If they're all from God, so if you stand for some, that's you're in a sense making a distinguishing mark than all the rest, and perhaps even this gets sort of merged together with a major historical debate that took place. Perhaps that when we used to have our tefillah today in the morning is we say the Shema and we say the Shemona Esrei. Historically, we'd say the Shema and the Ten Commandments and the Shemona Esrei. Why did we stop saying the Ten Commandments? So when Christianity began to sort of grow and sort of overtake the Roman Empire, the rabbis had a real fear. Because what did the Christianity say? It was an antinomialist idea, right? They said, you don't have to do all the actions. You don't need to do Brit Milah. You don't have to do Shabbat. That was their sales pitch to the Roman Empire. Because the Romans said, we can't give up Shabbat, and we certainly do not want to do Brit Milah. So the Christianity, really, Paul says, you don't have to do any of that. It's just about belief and some fundamental basic values, but not all the minutia of all the mitzvot. So when they started arguing that, how would it look if Jews every morning start praying the Shema and then the Ten Commandments? How might you interpret that? Yes, the Ten Commandments are very important, but the rest of the commandments are less important. And because of that fear of how it might look, the rabbis actually said, stop saying the Ten Commandments. It's not a requirement to say it. Stop saying it because of how it will be interpreted by the burgeoning Christian community. However, Rav Sadia Gaon connects the two. He says within the Ten Commandments themselves are actually all 613 commandments. If you look at that, it's actually a poem. He didn't make a major philosophical statement. Anochi eish ochla v'no'art mikol hanorot, that I have this burning flame that is consuming everywhere and that enlightens and goes through all the different streams, right? Meaning something small actually has an impact on everything. The divrei ka'esh, and these words are like fire. Nitzitzia harbe, and there's many sparks. mitzvot mikol dibor zoheret, meaning there's there's many mitzvot in every single one of these sparks. B'chachmati klalati be'aseret dibrotai. This is God speaking. My wisdom and my rules in these 10 commandments. Sheshmot shloshes mitzvot l'horot. There's actually 613 in these 10 commandments, 10 utterances that I've just said. By the way, there's a parallel example to this in this book that I found on my bookshelf, The 7 Laws of Noah. It's actually written, but I don't think it's the same one, written by a Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein in 1981. But I've looked through Rav Aaron Lichtenstein's works from Gush Etzion. Sure, it's called The 7 Laws of Noah by Aaron Lichtenstein, but I don't believe it's Aaron Lichtenstein, the former Rosh Yeshiva of the yeshiva in Gush Etzion. What?
We just heard in the last year he has a cousin by the same.
So this must be the cousin. This must be the cousin, who is also a rabbi, and he writes an entire book on the 7 laws of Noach, the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, and what he tries to show is in each mitzvah, the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, there's actually, because it starts off, there was this priest, who in the, I think 1700s or so, he starts learning Hebrew. And when he starts learning Hebrew, he says, my previous belief system doesn't make any sense. The things that I always quoted text to prove a belief in Christianity, I see the Hebrew actually, when you look at the text itself, doesn't justify it. So he begins to learn more about Judaism, and he wants to convert. And he turns to a couple of rabbis, and they discourage him, and they say, you don't have to convert. Why not just become a follower of the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach? And the priest is very disappointed. And he says, it's not fair. You get all these mitzvot, you have all these things to do. I get these 7 very quick things, it's not really, I'm looking for something much more spiritual, which Judaism has. And so the response to him is, wait a second. There are more mitzvot in the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach than you think. These are actually just klalim. They're general rules, and each one, for example, let's take theft. In the mitzvah of do not steal, there's actually 16, right? So you have the mitzvah of lo tignavu, don't steal, but you also have the mitzvah of lo tigzol, right? Don't also commit robbery. You also have the mitzvah of not moving a landmark, lo tasig gvul. You have the mitzvah against cheating. You have the mitzvah of reputing a claim when money is owed, against overcharging, ona'ah, against coveting, because coveting leads to stealing, against desiring, which is also one of the 10 commandments we'll see later, against the labor or eating of such fruit when certain conditions are not met. In general, sometimes a laborer is allowed to eat fruit as he's picking, but not across the board. It could be a potential stealing, of taking some of that fruit home, to use exact weights and measures. The robber has to pay for whatever he's stolen. He goes on and on and on, and he shows that all these other mitzvot are included in the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach. And if that's true, the parallel makes sense as well with regards to the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments, as Rav Sadia Gaon would say, is more than just the 10 Commandments. These are actually, some will argue, he argues, 10 general rules, and within these general rules, all the other mitzvot are going to be included, which solves some problems for us, because if you'll see, some of these are repeated. So if they are nearly repeated, for example, in Deuteronomy, the last mitzvah here in the Yitro of the 10 Commandments is do not covet, lo tachmod. The last one in Dvarim is lo titava'eh, do not desire. They really seem very, very similar. But if you understand that this is a general klal, now you can understand that there are specifics within them. And we'll see when we get to that these are actually 2 different mitzvot, although they're in the same general theme. If you look at the source just below the Rav Sadia Gaon, this is actually from the Sefer Chinuch. We're on mitzvah number 25. But in mitzvah 416, he actually speaks about this very question. And if you look at the 3rd paragraph of the Sefer Chinuch number 416, it begins with the word, and it is practiced. He's talking about the mitzvah of not to desire. right? Similar to our not to covet. And it is practiced in every place at all times by males and females. All the people of the world are also obligated about it, since it is a branch of the commandment against theft, right? I just mentioned that, which is one of the 7 commandments that all the people of the world were commanded. And do not err, my son. Remember, the Sefer Chinuch, the whole book is written to his son. Just as a review for their very first class, he sees his son playing outside during Shabbat services, and he says, I got to write a book that will be interesting to my son. And so therefore he writes a book based really on the Rambam Sefer Mitzvot. The Rambam puts his Sefer Mitzvot according to what he thinks are his importance. So number 1 mitzvah is belief in God, according to the Rambam. Sefer Chinuch says, I'm going to do it chronologically according to how they appear in the Torah. So his first mitzvah is Pru'ervu, because it goes back to Bereshit and God's commandment to Adam and Eve. So he says, do not err, my son, with the well-known tally of the 7 commandments of Noachites mentioned in the Talmud, as only 7. Truthfully, these 7 are only like general principles. They have many, many details, many, many more mitzvot. So that's the last sort of introductory statement about the 10 commandments, that they could also be not just 10 commandments, but they could actually be much, much larger, which would give us another reason why we're not so concerned that there are 14 or 13 or 20, right? Because at the end of the day, it's 10 general rules that include much more than that. Okay, now we move to the actual mitzvah. Mitzvah number 25, which is at the very bottom of what we just read. It says commanding belief. And the question that I want to look at in this mitzvah is, how can you command belief? If you look on the right column of that second page, number 2, Sefer Chinuch number 25, okay? The commandment of belief in God. To believe that the world has one God that caused all that exists, and that all that is and was and will be forever and ever from his power and his will, and that he took us out of Egypt and gave us the Torah. And he then quotes, as I've mentioned previously, the Sefer Chinuch will always give us his source. He'll tell us the mitzvah, he'll give us the source, he'll tell us the philosophical root behind the mitzvah, and then he'll give us how it applies. The mitzvah, he tells us, is to believe in God. The question is, how can that be a mitzvah? How can you command someone to believe? You either believe, many people call it a gift, or you don't believe. You can't force someone to believe something that they don't actually believe. It's not like shaking a lulav. I can force you to do the lulav. I can see if it's verifiable. Belief, if you don't really believe, you can say I want to believe, but it doesn't necessarily change what's really deep down in your kishkas. So the question is, how can the Sefer Chinuch, and not just him, how can this be the first commandment? Believe in God. So, first of all, there are some people who say it's not a commandment. That's why when we say it called the Aseret HaDibrot, rather than the 10 mitzvot, some say the first dibor, I am the Lord your God, is not a commandment at all. It doesn't even command. It says, I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt. It's a statement. And indeed, the Ramban doesn't believe this is a commandment. He says the whole Torah only makes sense if you have belief in God, right? All the values, why would you do anything if you don't believe in God? He says but it's just common sense, but it's not an actual mitzvah. We can't actually command this mitzvah. And he actually, if we go back to the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, he actually has a good proof text. What are the 7 mitzvot in the Gemara, which is in Sanhedrin? What are the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach? Do you remember those? I'll read them to you because I have them in front of me. Theft, justice, which is to establish courts, homicide, not to murder, illicit intercourse, not to eat the limb of a living creature, idolatry, and blasphemy. There is not a statement that you must believe in God. There's a statement that says you can't blaspheme God, and there's a statement that you do not have any other gods, which is more parallel to our second commandment, but there's not, like this first commandment, I am the Lord your God. There's not a belief in God that, according to the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach. So the Ramban asks the Rambam, Nachmanides asks the Maimonides, and he says, in the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, we don't have this parallel thing, and yet obvious God is underlying all these things. So it makes sense that should be the same in our Torah as well. If you want to say that this is actually a mitzvah, as the Rambam does, he says belief in God is a mitzvah, just as the Sefer Chinuch does. If you want to say that, then you would have to say there's not 7 mitzvot b'nei Noach, but there's 8 mitzvot b'nei Noach. And since there's not, it seems to me that this should not be counted as a mitzvah at all. So how does the Sefer Chinuch and the Rambam and others get around this and say that this is actually a mitzvah? And so their general answer is that belief can be connected to an action. And it's the action that's a mitzvah, whether or not you actually have the belief. Okay, so there's something verifiable, there's something you can actually do, whether or not you believe. And what I want to do in the rest of the Shir is to look at some of the different suggestions of what is that action. Okay? The Rambam, for example, since we were talking about him, if you jump down to number 4 on this last column, the Rambam's position is that belief in God, well, we can actually read it in the Yichot Isodei HaTorah. The most fundamental foundations and the pillar of wisdom is to know that there's a primary being who brought us into being of all existence, and that all exists in the heavens and the earth and what is between them came into existence only by virtue of the truth of his being. This entity is the God of the world, master of the entire earth, and knowledge of this concept is a positive commandment. So what is and then he quotes our source, I am the Lord your God. What is the commandment according to the Rambam? Knowledge. This fits with the Rambam. The Rambam is the philosopher. He says, how do you fulfill the mitzvah of belief in God? It's not about believing in God. It's about getting knowledge about God. It's going to classes. It's reading in the library. It's studying the philosophers, thinking about Aristotle and the first cause. Rambam is an Aristotelian, so he would say do that as well. It's contemplating and looking out at the whole world. And when you look at the world and you see, well, you start thinking of proofs. Well, for example, the proof of the world from order. Right? There's a famous philosophers always talk about, for example, if you saw a beautifully well-written document, let's say a Shakespearean play, you have 2 choices. Did the play come from an author, or did the play come from a bunch of monkeys that are just randomly hitting on a typewriter? What are the chances that these monkeys just randomly hitting on a typewriter would ever produce Shakespeare? The answer is not very likely, and that's one of the arguments for the belief in God. Right? The belief in God is, if you look around the world and you look at how complicated just the eye is, or if you look at how complicated photosynthesis is on the plants, or how anything in this world has this tremendous order, so there must be, when there's tremendous order, there must be something that ordered it, right? If you're walking in the mountains and all of a sudden you see a rock formation that says hello, and then you walk a little further and then it says in the rocks, hello, how are you doing? And you go a little further and it says, hello, Ruti, how are you doing? So you have a choice. You can either think, wow, there must have been an avalanche and the rocks sort of fell into place randomly, spelling out, hello, how are you doing? Or someone was there before you who organized it. The Rambam would say, when you start studying these type of proofs, that's just one proof that I've offered, the argument from design. But if you start looking into the Rambam doesn't say that particular proof. There's other proofs that are put forth. There's the proof of the cosmological, which is, if the scientists tell us that there's a Big Bang. Well, when there is a beginning, that means there had to be something that created that beginning, what Aristotle would call the first cause. So there's cosmological, there's ontological, there's different ways of understanding. And what the Rambam says is you have to explore these. You have to look into these type of philosophical debates, and you will come to understand God as a result of these type of debates. And when you do that, you're fulfilling the mitzvah of I am the Lord your God, because you're pursuing that knowledge. What's interesting about the Rambam is because he sees this in a philosophical way, he doesn't have a need for the second half of the statement, I'm the Lord your God that took you out of the land of Egypt. Right? Took you out of the land of Egypt is parochial, right? It's my own personal experience. He's not talking about that. He's saying, no, you come to know God independent of God in history. All the other commentaries we're going to look at, they very much rely on the second half of the statement, who took you out of the land of Egypt. It's about experiencing. It's about the Rabbi Yehuda Levi, for example, says, how do we know God? Well, we know God because we were experienced and we were redeemed and liberated by God. And because our parents told us that story, and their parents told them that story, and it goes all the way back, that's why, for example, it doesn't say, I'm the Lord your God who created the world. Because that we can't go back to. But we can go back to a real experience, and that's where belief in God comes from. It says, just share the stories. That's what belief in God says. So that's the Rambam's understanding of the action. The action is study, knowledge. That's the mitzvah of I am the Lord your God. I mentioned to you already, if I go down all the ones that I brought here, I mentioned already number one, which is the Ramban, who says there is no mitzvah. It's just introductory. The Sefer Chinuch we've already alluded to, right? The Sefer Chinuch, both here in Parshat Yitro, mitzvah number 25, as well as the one that I brought previously, 4:16, do not desire. He says as follows. He says, don't be silly and think that you can't control belief. Right? I said you can't control belief. He says that's not true. He says in number 416, if you look at the very top, this is now on the left-hand side. And do not wonder to say, and how is it that the hand of man to prevent his heart from desiring a storehouse of every delight? Right? Because mitzvah 416 is do not desire. And so a person could say, just as we said, you can't control belief, you could also say, you can't control desire. The heart wants what the heart wants. And he says that's absurd. Your heart may initially want that, but you can do certain things to control your desires. Right? You can think about certain things. Thought influences speech, which influences action. You think about certain things. You make sure that you don't see certain things. You make sure that you talk about certain things. You make sure that you then engage in certain actions that push you away from the activities of your desire. So he says that in 4:16, very sharply, in fact. He says, the thing is not like this, and only silly evildoers and those that sin with their souls say that you really can't control it. As truly it is the hand of man to prevent himself and his thoughts and his desires from anything he wants. You can control that. And then in our mitzvah, number 25, he adds that further. He says, to believe that the world was created by God. Now to the second paragraph. I'm on the last column of the second page, under the Sefer Chinuch, which is source number 2. And it's the second paragraph. The root of this commandment does not need elucidation. The matter is known and revealed to all that the belief is the foundation of religion, and then one who does not believe in it denies a fundamental principle and has no share. And the content of the belief is that he fixes in his soul that such is the truth and that a change is impossible. And if he's asked about it, he will respond to the inquirer that his heart believes, right? Speech is going to influence his belief. And he talks again and again about engaging in certain behaviors that encourage your belief. And he ultimately says there is an action. The action is to act as if you believe, right? As we said with the mitzvah number 16, with regards to Pesach, fake it till you make it, right? You keep saying things, and then eventually you'll believe in things. Of course, the challenge with all this is, are you tricking yourself? And we spoke about that once before. He doesn't have a problem with that. He says, and I'm going to give you a proof that what he actually says is you're not tricking yourself. That's the last thing we end with. So just keep that question in the back of your mind. The Ibn Ezra, he says the mitzvah, the action, right? The action that you have to be engaged in is love. It's not just about knowing God, not just believing God. It's love. And you can do actions that show your love for God and show your closeness to God. And the only challenge with that I put in the parentheses there, really, is that the Sefer Chinuch has a separate mitzvah about loving God. So if you hold by the Sefer Chinuch, then the Ibn Ezra doesn't solve your problem here, because the Sefer Chinuch says there's already a mitzvah about loving God, not connected to belief.
Where was this that you just
The love of God? That's number 3. Ibn Ezra, love, fear, and closeness to God. Number 5, okay? Number 5, the Rebbeinu B'chai says, what is the actionable way you can express belief in God? He says, whenever they talk about belief in the Torah doesn't usually talk about believers. It usually uses the word, like, belief is emunah, right? Lahamin. But when it describes people like Abraham or Job, Eov, it describes them as not those who believe in God, but ne'emaneh, those who are faithful, or those who act with trust. And that's the Rebbeinu B'chai's position. He says, there's such a thing called belief, and then there's such a thing as trust. Trust is not necessarily the same as belief. Your parent comes to you and says, I want you to do this. Trust me, this is the right thing for you. Sometimes you don't really believe that they're right. But because they're your parent, you trust them, which means you act as if you're saying that they're correct. Even if you have a doubt whether or not they're right, you're acting as if you accept what they're saying, you trust them. And that's the whole Rebbeinu B'chai's things. Where the mitzvah of belief in God is to trust in God. That you take chances in your life because that's what God wants you to do. I often think of, for example, the Zionist endeavor is an act of trust in God. Right? There are many people who say, I believe in God, I believe in the Torah, I believe in all these things, but then they don't come to Israel when they have the opportunity. And then there's others say, I don't know if it's the right thing, but it seems to me that this is what God wants. I'm going to jump and I'm going to do it. It's an expression of trust, and that, I would say, therefore, is included, according to Rebbeinu B'chai, within the mitzvah of belief in God. The first of the 10 commandments is to act in that way. However, you have a little bit of a dilemma here, because trust in God can be taken to an extreme. I put down here notes, 2 examples, healing and the Holocaust. If you're sick, should you go to a doctor or not? Now, if you trust in God, right, in Cheskiyahu, right, the famous case of Cheskiyahu Melech, the prophet Isaiah comes to him and says, you're going to die. And Cheskiyahu turns immediately to the kier, to the wall, and begins to pray to God, and he's given 15 extra years. And the commentators say he could have gone to a doctor. He did not go to the doctor when he was ill. He turned to God. That's an act of trust, of faith, and he's rewarded for that. And the Ramban says, that's what you're supposed to do. You're not supposed to go to a doctor. Today, we're in a much lower level. But in those days, you should go to a prophet. Right? If you're sick, you go to a prophet, you go to a rabbi. Going to a doctor is a sign of lack of faith in God, that God can heal you. Connected to Cheskiyahu, there's another actually interesting proof text. So that's Cheskiyahu HaMelech. Okay? And the Ramban supports that idea. The Ramban, and by the way, Rashi also, says, you turn to God, don't go to doctors. Right? That's a lack of faith to go to doctors. Today you have permission to go to a doctor, but not a commandment, okay? The Cheskiyahu HaMelech, we're told, had a book of healing, that he had all these things that could heal almost any illness. And to his great credit, say the commentaries, he hid that book so people didn't rely on medicine or logic or reason, but they would only rely on tefillah, and therefore they would heal through that. So that's one form of trust, which I imagine to many of us, the modern mind, feels a little bit uncomfortable. So of course, thankfully, we have someone else on the other side. Who do you think that is? If I mention the Ramban and Rashi on one side, the Rambam, Maimonides, who is a doctor, right? And in fact, the Shulchan Aruch paskins like the Rambam, who says not only are you permitted to go to a doctor, if you're ill, you are commanded to go to a doctor. He says that story about Cheskiyahu HaMelech, he hid that book not because it had all the secrets of healing. It's that it had a lot of magic and a lot of, bubba misas and a lot of, and the Rambam says, you're not supposed to go to bad medicine. You're not supposed to go to witchcraft. That borders on idolatry. But if you have a doctor who has real skills, who can say, that's how you have a mitzvah to live. and you're not allowed to turn away from rational thought. This is God gave us our minds, God gave us these healing powers, so you must go, says the Rambam, and as well as the Shulchan Aruch Paskins like the Rambam. Another case is the Holocaust. In 1944, there was a letter written to Rabbi Eliyahu Dessler. He was at one point in time the head of the Kollel in Gateshead. He wrote the famous work, the Michtav Me'Eliyahu. He becomes the Mashkiach Ruchani, I believe, in Panovich near the end of his life. Someone writes him a letter challenging and saying, how are we to understand? There were a lot of Gedolim in the 1930s and even in the 1940s in Europe who were asked questions of, should I go to Israel? Should I go to America? Should I leave? And have you ever seen these letters? Some of the letters that the Gedolim wrote back are absolutely heartbreaking to read. They say, do not go to America. Your soul will be destroyed. Do not go to Israel. Your soul will be destroyed. The only safe place in this world is to stay here in Vilna or stay here in Europe. And people followed them. And in following them, many of them signed their own death warrants. And so a person writes a letter in 1944, so after a lot of this is already known. Rav Dessler, how are we to understand the failure of the Gedolim? Included in that, by the way, is Rav Elchanan Wasserman, who wrote a letter and told people not to leave. And so Rav Dessler attacks the writer of the letter and says what they said is true, they have truth in that, all these different things. You should never reject what the Gedolim have to say. Maybe you didn't understand it, all these. But he doesn't justify their answer of saying they should have stayed. He just says that you shouldn't have attacked, and you don't understand, and it's our weakness, not their weakness. The editors, by the way, if you ever have a book, the Michtav Me'Eliyahu, the editors didn't want to leave it like that because it made it look Rav Dessler perhaps, not 100% as strong as he could have. So the editors actually point out that in North Africa, Rommel was on his way to Eretz Yisrael. And there was one battle, Al-Amineh, I think it's called, where the truth is the Germans should have won. And they write that it was only a miracle that the Allies were able to defeat Rommel there. And if the Allies hadn't defeated Rommel there, he would have come into Eretz Yisrael and totally destroyed it completely. So maybe the Gedolim were right. Of course, you could then argue the exact opposite and say, well, if there was a miracle protecting Eretz Yisrael, that's proof the opposite of the case. But anyway, there's another example of where absolute trust and absolute faith could lead you astray. Like, how do you then deal with these issues? So the Chazon Ish has, I think, a famous book called Emunah Ubitachon, and he tries to give us a quick understanding. Okay. He says as follows. This is the last, it's number 5. It's the last paragraph, okay? This is the Chazon Ish. He says, there is an error in understanding for many people about the true meaning of trust in Hashem. For these people, they believe that in every situation there's a good and bad, and since Hashem is good, so long as they believe and trust in Hashem, then good will prevail. And if bad prevails, it means you had a lack of faith. Right? I didn't believe enough in God if I didn't go to the doctor, and instead I went to just to pray, and I still got ill, and I still had terrible consequences. It's because I didn't pray hard enough. I didn't have enough faith. So he says, that's not true. He says, that's not what bitachon really means, not what trust really means. Bitachon is a matter of trust that there is no coincidence in the world. Everything that's taking place is from God. And everything that transpires under the sun results from an announcement from him, may he be blessed. Meaning it's all from God. But there are some instances that will appear bad to us. But it's not necessarily then a lack of faith or a lack of trust or a flaw in what's taking place. He says, for example, if a person is asked by the Torah to give up their life, right? They're given a choice of either to have their life saved or to be a martyr because, and in the case where you'd have to be a martyr, you're asked to kill someone else or you're asked to do something else like that. So you give up your life. From your point of view, that is not the good result, right? You've given up your life. That's a bad result. But that doesn't emanate from a lack of faith. or a lack of trust, right? There are going to be bad things that happen in this world that is not at all a sign of lack of faith in God or a lack of trust in God. And so what the Chazon Ish says is that you have to follow, if there's an opportunity to go to a doctor to save your life, you go to that. That's not an act of lack of faith just because God is not necessarily providing for you in that instance. Okay? So he says he colors a little bit of trying to understand when to go forward and when not. I just want to add one last point and end with this point. Number 6, I kind of picked on Rav Elchanan Wasserman for writing the letter during the Holocaust, right before really. So I want to share with you something that he teaches that I think is very nice, and it answers the question that I asked previously about, well, are we just fooling ourselves if you sort of act in a way that forces your belief? So Rav Elchanan Wasserman says something like this. He says, the default position in life is to believe. He says, we are all born as believers. Ask children. They have no qualms. They have no problems with believing in something they can't see. Right? If you ask a kid to come up and say, touch the desk, it's real. Touch this, it's real. And then you say, touch your mother's love for you. Now, they can't touch it, but they know that it's absolutely real. They have no cynicism. They understand, for them, that love is real. They understand that God is real. Children have that problem. He says, but over time, we become more cynical. And the pressures of life sort of create a hardening of our hearts. Right? The heart is also connected to the mind. And so therefore, we begin to find it harder and harder to believe in things. That's why we had to leave Egypt. Right? It says, I'm the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt. What did we do in Egypt? We had to have our hearts circumcised. You ever wonder, what does that mean to have your heart circumcised? Right? It doesn't seem like that's a very healthy thing for your heart to do. But what it's really saying is you have to get rid of the crud, and it's not tricking yourself into believing something you don't believe. It's the exact opposite. It's removing things that stop your natural tendency to want to believe. And so that's what Rav Wasserman says. This mitzvah, I'm the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt, is just try to get back to your natural state. And, when it says the Jews couldn't listen to Moshe because kotzer ruach, because of all the suffering and the struggles, that happens to all of us. Because of all the different pressures in life and all the different experiences, we've built up a hardening of our arteries, and we have to remove that to get back to where we originally are. And I just want to end by pointing out that social scientists have now come around to supporting what Rav Wasserman has said. So, as you can imagine, most scientists are usually not big supporters of religion. And for them, their belief in God, they argue, was actually created by human beings as a mechanism of exerting power over others. Almost all, until about 30 or 40 years ago, almost all anthropologists would argue that the notion of God was created by agricultural surplus, that there was, when there were nomads, there was no belief in God. And then once you have agricultural societies, all of a sudden you have all this extra wheat, and you have to protect it. So what do? So the ruling powers say, well, there's a God that says do not steal, and therefore you should be very fearful of this God, and make sure you leave, our agricultural surplus with us. And of course, the other belief in God that was very helpful is that it also protected the rulers because they were God's representatives on earth. So then about 30 or 40 years ago, there's a guy by the name of Jack Covant who says, wait a second, we actually now have, and they found where there's fire, where people would sit around and eat from before, when there were nomads from before agricultural, and they found a lot of religious symbols from that period of time, well before agricultural. And he suggests there is obviously a belief in God, belief in spiritual ritual, well before this period of time up. And so he sort of revolutionized the idea and made an argument that the belief in God is actually somewhat natural in humanity. There is these two concepts, I hope I say them correct, ontogeny and phylogeny. Ontogeny is how the individual human being develops, right? A kid starts off crawling, and then he's walking, and then, gets older and older. Phylogeny is how the species develops. And there is a belief, it's very similar if you think about it, how we say, Masim avot simam lebanim, the actions of the fathers are symbolic, everything repeats itself on some level. What happens to Avraham happens to the entire nation of the Jewish people. So ontogeny, what happens to an individual human being, is also replicated in phylogeny, in how the species develops. So he argues that we're now doing the reverse. The species, human species, developed with a belief in God. It's a natural tendency, just as children develop a natural tendency. And then, of course, it becomes more challenging as society develops and becomes more modern and sophisticated. It tries to sort of suffocate that belief, but it's really a natural part that was placed within us. Now, what does that mean it's placed within us? So evolutionary biologists actually now have come along and said, yes, the belief in God is a natural thing, but it's done for evolutionary advantage. How so? It's called agency. Believing in something that you don't see. So if you were out on the African agency, if you're on the African safari, and all of a sudden you're sitting down and there's a leaf rustling, off to the side, but you can't see anything. If you believe that there's something behind that leaf, like a tiger, and you run away, you're going to live another day. And if you don't believe something that you can't see, you're going to get eaten by the tiger. So evolutionary biologists say there is a natural tendency to believe in that which you cannot see for an evolutionary advantage. For me, that makes perfect sense. But the only difference I would say is, yeah, it's an advantage, but who put that evolutionary advantage in the first place? How did it develop? I would say, well, God gave us that natural ability, meaning God wanted us to have a natural ability to connect with God, because it is very difficult. We're limited, and God is infinite. So it's not natural that we're going to be able to connect with one another. So one of the great gifts that God gives us is a natural tendency to want to believe in God, and that's what Rav Wasserman is saying. It's always there. The hard work, right? I said belief requires action. The hard work is not tricking yourself into believing something, but trying to remove those things that are blocking your natural ability to believe in God. It's innate. And next week we'll go the opposite. Don't have any other gods before God. Yeah.
There's 3 cardinal sins. One of them is the Avodah Zarah.
Yes.
Was that, I'm looking at this, number 26.
Yes.
Making an idol that balances or worshiping.
You'll have to come next week. No, that's exactly what we're going to talk about. All those different things about what's included in Avodah Zarah. The Rambam especially has a much more expansive list than what some others will say.